And with that hopeful note, we will pause for discussion. I hope I haven't painted too bleak a picture. But I do think that what we heard from the voices of the communities.
I think you might need a glass of water now. That was quite a lot.
And inability to
very fascinating. We've got. I thought what we could do is we've got two questions from people who are listening in, and I think I'm going to ask you to answer those first, and then we will see if we can get Alfred online. I see he is actually online, but whether or not we can hear him is another matter. But we'll see if he can respond to this first part of the presentation. So here are the questions that I've got for you. The first one, the question is, will this research be conducted in Dadaab, Kenya? If not, can someone else use tools in their work in Dadaab to replicate? And then the second question is another experience from Kenya. Increasing numbers of children, particularly girls affected by HIV, are coming across from DRC to Nairobi. The local community child protection mechanisms are not really responding to these. Well, actually, that's not really a question. It's more of a comment. So maybe you want to address the question regarding Dadaab and then maybe comment a little bit on the second point. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for those questions and comments. We do not intend to undertake this research in Dadaab. This was the first attempt to undertake this form of research, which has been undertaken in many other settings, in a refugee setting. The feeling at the time of the country selection was that Dadaab had simply been over-researched in recent years, and that Dadaab was a setting that was probably facing research fatigue, and so we did opt for settings that were not receiving as much research. In terms of whether or not the tools could be used, there are many tools available, most on the Community Child Protection Exchange. The only caveat that I would add is that this is really quite sensitive research, and the ethical considerations actually require the lion's share of the training time. So with a 2-week researcher training, about a week of that is dedicated to ensuring that this research is undertaken ethically, that data protection protocols are in place, that attitude. I think attitude is a very important ethical consideration when you're undertaking this form of research. That the researchers' attitudes are really matching the nature of the research. This isn't, even though it's only 4 weeks of data collection, much of the quality of the data relies upon building trust with the participants and ensuring that they're not going to feel betrayed by anything that you will reveal about them. In the end, we're trying to reveal and highlight what they themselves are saying. So communicating that in the right way becomes difficult. So yes, there are tools available, and I would recommend looking at the resources section of the Community Child Protection Exchange, whose website we'll end with. I completely would believe that the arrival of girls from DRC into Nairobi was not being picked up by the child protection community there. And that is something where I would think that whoever provided that comment probably has some form of insight around that phenomenon, and maybe developing a short piece to start to raise awareness of that could help to bring attention so that more could be learned about the situation of those girls.
Sorry, I'm going to bring you back now to Dadaab again. We've had another couple of comments. Someone's commented the applicability of this research to camp contexts such as Dadaab would be interesting, but is it explored? Okay, I think you've probably answered some of that. This question might be answered directly through Rwanda camp research findings, though. And another question, stroke comment, question, what are the main differences in perception of harm by communities and agencies? I.e., do they have different perceptions of harm? Okay, so that's not so much around Dadaab, but around how we understand the concept of harm to children. That's quite an interesting comment. And what did you pick up from your research, Mark?
Yeah. So actually the second country, Rwanda, is a camp setting. And so I think that will be more applicable to the question about whether or not this is applicable to a camp setting like Dadaab. We did adapt the tools to each country, and so that adaptation occurred with the national research team in line with what they knew of working with these communities. And so the tools did end up looking slightly different in the two different countries. The tools themselves will be available when the final reports are available at the end of the month, and we'll share those through both the Community Child Protection Exchange and the CPC Learning Network. But the main difference in perception of harm by communities and agencies, I think, is very interesting. When you look at what agencies think about, it is really types of harm that occur to children. Sexual violence very quickly comes to the forefront, and agencies are really thinking about how to ensure that children are not victims of sexual and other forms of gender-based violence. Beating of children and harms in the home is something that agencies are really concerned about. Agencies, of course, are concerned about school and school enrollment, but they don't necessarily think about it as a child protection issue. That's a quote-unquote education issue. And I think the fact that the communities are telling us so strongly that the fact that their adolescents can't go to school and then fall into delinquent behaviors really gives us pause and makes us think about, what are the longer-term effects of not being in school. I think we know some of the, obviously a life cycle is interrupted by dropping out of school. But then when you look at the actual immediate protection harms that these children face, they include alcohol abuse, drug abuse, involvement in gang activity, transactional sex, commercial sex work, sexual exploitation, risk of trafficking. It's really quite serious, harmful things in the life of anybody, but then you think that this is in the life of a child, and it's cause for serious alarm. So what seems like dropping out of school on the surface, when you dig in a little bit, has really much more dire consequences that need to be unpacked. And this is a summary presentation, so I didn't go into this as much as I would have liked to, but I hope I can a bit more with the Rwanda research. And we did use body mapping for younger children. And those results are summarized in the reports, but I think you'll see from the reports, it's very hard to draw useful conclusions from body mapping. And it is a methodology that we use, but one that garnered less information, I think, and less relevant information than our other forms of data collection.
Thanks, Mark. Mark, I'm going to cut in there. We've got a couple more for you. You started answering one regarding using methodologies to capture inputs from younger children. There's also another question about the schools, but what I'm going to suggest is that we try and get Alfred to respond, and we move on. I'm just aware of time, and we'll try and answer these questions at the next break for question time. So I'm hoping that Alfred can hear us and that he can push his talk button on the top left-hand side. Everyone, please just bear with us for a couple of minutes while we see if Alfred can hear us and actually get online. We didn't have a chance to do an audio test with him. Okay, Alfred? Alfred? Yeah, I think there's a bit of a challenge with that. So I would say, Alfred, we're going to carry on with the next part of the presentation. And hope that we can maybe get you at the end, but we realize there's quite a difficult connection. So Mark, are you happy to just go on to the next part? And I just want to, because I'm not here to wave a piece of paper at you telling you how much time there is, it is now 4:45, so I think we need to move forward a little bit with the presentation for the second half. Okay, over to you.
All right, and I think you'll see that we've covered the methodology and a lot of the themes are the same in Rwanda, so I should be able to move through these more quickly. And then somebody had commented that they were hoping to see recommendations, and we collated the recommendations across both countries at the end of this. In Rwanda, you know, both countries have protracted refugee settings, but in Rwanda, these were protracted camp settings over the course of nearly 2 decades now. And what was very evident was that this had led to a breakdown of normal family and community structures. Adults commented that they were distressed by their inability to provide for their children and to protect them in the way that they wished to. And adolescents themselves were quite distressed by the perceived weakness of their parents. And so it was interesting to see both sides of this coin, that not only did parents want to do more for their children, the adolescents, who normally we think of adolescents as rebellious and, you know, wanting to, you know, stand up to their parents, really had a sense of pity for their parents. 2 quotes to illustrate this from the get-go. An adult woman: "We try to advise them, tell them that we understand that life here in the camps is hard. Someday God will help us, and we shall have a better life. Children do not listen to us, as they think it cannot get better than this. They have lost all hope for a better future. And in the end, they get involved in bad behavior." A few more contextual notes about Rwanda. One is that the refugees there do not have the right to work. They aren't able to farm. They receive full rations from the World Food Program. And the future does seem quite bleak for most of them. Of the long-term solutions for refugees, which are either integration into the country where they're being hosted, returning home, or resettlement in a third country. Of the 60,000 refugees in Rwanda, only 10,000 of those currently have any form of long-term solution. So it's not difficult to understand where the sense of hopelessness and losing hope for a better future comes from. One young woman adds, "I'm not that old. I fled the Democratic Republic of Congo when I was 5 years old. If I said I knew what life was like then, I would be lying. I wouldn't know. I don't know how they used to take care of children. All I know about culture is what I have witnessed here. I don't know anything else." I thought this was very poignant in pointing out that in the space of the one generation, traditional ways of child rearing can be lost. Again, in terms of the key harms, the out-of-school adolescence was absolutely the #1 headline, not to be missed finding from both camps in Rwanda that every group started telling their story with. In these camps, there is free education through secondary 3, which is about 13 or 14 years old, after which point there is no more schooling provided to children. There have been scholarship programs in schools run by international NGOs in the past, but those have recently closed. And communities really perceive that this, this lack of schooling was what was opening the door to children to get involved in very risky behaviors, prostitution or sexual exploitation for girls, which led to early pregnancy, and boys falling into generally delinquent behaviors, drug and alcohol abuse, stealing and fighting. We actually did a group discussion with gang members, and the gang was called the Thirsty Rasta, which was very fascinating to me. Very well known, not a hidden part of the community. And a typical gang mentality that they were actually providing a structure and a family for the children. Interestingly, despite this overwhelming focus on adolescents coming from the communities, there was no program for them. And I think this gets back to that question we got after the Uganda: how did the perceived harms differ between the service providers and the NGOs and the communities? And this is one where the communities were kind of screaming at the top of their lungs that they wanted programming for adolescents. school primarily for adolescents, and this was not hitting the radar of the service-providing agencies. Basically, other than a few, there were some martial arts groups that we saw that local community members were running for some of the adolescents. And there are child protection committees in these camps that are linked to the camp management structures. But really there was no specific programming for adolescents, and there were no school supports for adolescents. Not unlike Uganda, the linkages and people's ability to access quote-unquote formal community-based child protection mechanisms was very limited. I think there is a difference here, though, whereas in Uganda, the refugees of from Somalia and Congo felt discriminated against. They were trying to access services provided largely by the Ugandan government with support from NGOs that were refugee assisting organizations. Remember that in Rwanda these are camps, so they were managed by UNHCR in collaboration with the Rwandan government, but primarily by UNHCR with a few international NGOs. So they were entirely dependent upon these service providers for anything that they received, from food to health care to education to water to housing. And there were real perceptions of corruption, and there was a lack of trust between the camp members, the people living in the camp, and the people supposed to serve them. So the camp committees were comprised of people who had been quote-unquote elected from the refugee population, but there was the perception that cases were managed, supports were provided more rapidly if bribes were given, or if depending on family and ethnic lineages. There was also just general dissatisfaction with the services provided, especially healthcare, but given that there had been secondary school beyond the S3 level that had disappeared, there was tremendous confusion and frustration as to why that support had been withdrawn. We mentioned that there were many family-based, clan-based, religious-based mechanisms in place in Uganda, and the same holds true to some extent in Rwanda. Parents, of course, were really the first line for their children, as anywhere in the world, and they would give a lot of different ways that they were trying to help their children, encouraging them to stay in school. Really, it came down to advice and parents kind of sitting and talking with their children. Again, this is against the backdrop where parents were economically and socially extremely disempowered, and so they felt that their word had very little value to their children. And there were no parent strengthening programs, very little that would bolster the parents to be able to play their primary protective role. Beyond parents, however, the other mechanisms that we noted were churches that were spreading child protection messages, around how to raise children, around keeping children in school, basic messages, but they were one venue. And they were also, in cases of extremely poor children or children who were living outside of their biological families, organizing supports by taking up donations. And the churches, both Catholic and Protestant, were allowing their buildings to be used for early childhood development centers that were being run by one of the international NGOs, and secondary school classes. And I do want to spend a minute or two talking about Hope School, which I've mentioned very briefly here. The Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration did ask us for a picture of the school, but we were not allowed to take photographs in the camp settings in Rwanda. Hope School was founded by teachers in their mid-20s who had earlier benefited from the secondary school and then college and university scholarships that were being provided in the past by international NGOs. they felt a tremendous responsibility to return to the camp and to open a school so that those adolescents who were just coming of age would not miss out on the opportunity to go to school entirely. It was really quite extraordinary. They convinced the camp management to collect a very small sum, I think it was about 75 cents per family in the camp of Gihembe per month, whether or not the family had secondary school-age children, which the camp inhabitants agreed was a worthwhile cause. And so for approximately $150 a month, most of which was procured by selling food rations or selling a small portion of their food rations, the refugees themselves were funding a secondary school. The teachers were doing this on a voluntary basis, and not all of them had been to university. Some had simply finished university, finished high school, and then for lack of something more productive to do, were volunteering back at the school teaching the next generation of high school students. So there were, of course, accreditation and quality issues, but this was a school that was absolutely driven by heart, and the students were so appreciative to be there and very appreciative to their older brothers and sisters who were doing this for them. And I just want to let that sink in again, that for $150 a month, they were running a secondary school from the food rations, from selling a portion of their food rations. I mean, I think that that was a very low-cost, extremely high-impact, self-generated intervention that the refugees had developed to provide structured learning time for their adolescents. All right, we're almost to an hour already, so I'm not sure if I should go into the recommendations and then we simply do questions and comments at the end.
Thanks, Mark. I'm thinking maybe yes. We've got two questions that were, well, they sort of related to the previous work in Uganda, but I think it's probably generic about the schools being protected places. I think maybe, I mean, we can go on till 4:15, so we've got 15 minutes. So perhaps, yeah, what you should do is go forward if you're feeling okay with that. We'll do the recommendations, then people can send in all their questions and we'll spend 5–10 minutes answering. But I think probably try and give yourself, I would say 10 minutes maximum for the recommendations. Sorry, if I was sitting next to you, I'd be more communicative. But for those of you listening in, Mark's sitting in New York and I'm sitting in Johannesburg. So it's quite a long way. So yeah, let's do 10 minutes of recommendations and then more questions. Over to you.
Sure, and I've tried to really summarize these so that we can zip right through them. None of these are going to seem like rocket science to any of you. They're pretty straightforward, but I think they're important and bear consolidation and repeating. You know, to assist refugee parents, I think would be our #1 guidance point, and recognizing that in both settings, parents were feeling extremely disempowered in two ways. And one was their lack of money, and the second was the impact that that lack of money was having on their relationship with their children. So I'm not sure that we're recommending here parenting interventions, but that the household unit and parents' ability to care for their children as the #1, as the frontline child protection workers, if we want to use our NGO lingo, really needs to be supported. And in both countries, income generation was a massive problem. I think this is a structural issue in both countries. There were reasons that the governments were either not allowing parents to work or adults to work, or you know, requiring that they waive their right to service delivery in order to live in a place where they could make money. And these are structural issues that will need to be dealt with at the level of those who are dealing with these governments. But at the programming level, you would also need some form of viable income generation promotion. And work around you know, helping to rebuild these parent-child relationships that have really suffered on account of that. Working on looking at those mechanisms that do exist, you know, so let's think of the churches, the associations, the clan-based structures. They were really kind of doing child protection in a void. They were doing what they knew, and they were sending out very basic messages, but working with those mechanisms that are already there, it could be, you know, relatively straightforward to help them to do slightly higher level child protection work. So the identification and monitoring of children, these are just some suggested activities that those mechanisms could be supported to do, and these are neither, you know, neither comprehensive nor necessarily the priority ones. They're the ones that we heard the most from community members, but you know, helping them to undertake an advocacy role with their local governments, with service providers on behalf of refugees, awareness raising, basic, right? And but I think the idea here is to bring the level of these existing mechanisms, so religious networks, clan-based networks, ethnic networks, and helping them to kind of up their game a little bit in what they're doing for children who are either at risk of violence and abuse or already suffering it. Again, this is, you'll have heard this one before, but there simply has to be funding for education, be it through income-generating activities for the parents to be able to send their children to school, or things like scholarship programs at the level of the school itself. And one question that the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration has asked us is, you know, the budgets for these two settings are not likely to increase anytime soon. What would you cut? And I don't think that the nature of our research allows us to answer that question very well. This wasn't a cost-benefit analysis of the various programs within the setting. However, $150 secondary school per month seems like a pretty easy win to me. Again, formal education is important, and continuing to ensure that, you know, especially in the urban setting, primary school-age children are able to access this, working very closely with the schools to ensure that they are keeping an eye out for and trying to integrate the refugees and their communities into their classrooms. I think that was one very interesting thing. For all of this research is focused on education. We almost never heard that teachers were playing an active role in trying to keep children in school. And what does that mean for all of the work that's being done? And I think that it really gives one pause. And as we collected the data, and we're several weeks in, we actually asked the research teams to put a special focus on teachers and to try and get a better sense of what role teachers were playing. And I don't know that in fact I do know, like we didn't get more information about that, and it seems that that's a real missed opportunity. In urban settings, children who are likely to be excluded from education, such as those outside of their biological families, mothers, children with disabilities, need special attention. And across the board, adolescents in secondary school need a lot more attention. In Uganda, the issue of language did pose a barrier. And given that many of the refugees arriving in Kampala did not speak English, the need for foundation classes or parallel classes to help them integrate the mainstream education system were perceived to be necessary. And then finally, preventing school dropout by promoting a lot of work with teachers, getting refugee parents to be more involved in school decision-making bodies, such as school committees, PTAs, where we saw very little involvement in the urban setting. And then tackling this issue of discrimination. 5 minutes, I made it through the key recommendations. I think one thing I would end on is that this research lends itself to really highlighting problems, and the solutions often are a bit more difficult, but I actually think there are some very straightforward, not so difficult solutions for this one. The primary one is to find mechanisms to ensure that children are actually in school. And at least from the community members' point of view, that would have a huge protective impact. Secondary schools should get special focus. And we know that those projects are harder to fund. But Hope School is a pretty extraordinary model that should be really examined in more depth. So if you ever happen to be anywhere near Gihembe Camp in Uganda, they're very friendly, and I would highly recommend asking for a tour of Hope School.
Thanks,
and then
Mark.
income generation and money for parents, I think.
Hi, Mark. Okay. Mark, I think you did brilliantly to get through those recommendations. We've had quite a lot of questions, actually, but I wanted to try one more time just to see if we could get Alfred online and give him a chance to respond to this, and then we'll proceed with a few questions after that. People have been very responsive and I think are very, very interested in this. So let's try for Alfred. Alfred, if you can hear us and you can speak, please push your talk button, and we invite you to respond with your thoughts around this presentation.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Alfred. Great.
Sarah, can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Mark, thank you very much for the presentation. I think you've done really justice to most of the issues. I just want to highlight a few issues that have been presented by Mark in the presentation, and also raise a few questions to most of the people who are dealing in the program areas. I think he raises a very important point about the key duty bearers, both in the formal and informal child protection mechanisms. But I think the issue is, as much as we identify these groups, to what extent are we building their capacities to enhance the protection of children? And I think we are seeing this in refugee settings, in IDP settings, and other emergency settings, that we identify these structures, but we never put in enough to build their capacity. And I think it's clearly you're saying you identify the parents are doing a good job, you identify the teachers, but to what extent are they being empowered to enhance the protection of children? Then the other issue is that in the Ugandan presentation, I think it was clearly you raised out some of the harm related to children, adolescents. But I think it would also be interesting for the people in the programming section to know which gender is disadvantaged by a given harm that is being identified. And I think I find this was quite brought out in the Rwandan experience. But I think it would also be very good, the Ugandan case, so that it can be of help to those people who are working with these children to see what category of children and what issues being addressed in enhancing their protection. Then the other issue that I noted is that you did raise the issue that there has been challenges in terms of coordination. The issue here in Uganda, for example, you find that the Minister of Education is dealing with education, but the refugees are also under the docket of the Prime Minister's office. Then you have the Minister of Gender, which deals with children. Now the issue here is how do you ensure that there is a strong coordination for issues that are related to children, especially refugee children, in a situation where there is a limited coordination. I think which brings the point that we must have strong coordination mechanisms, because the children seem to be falling in different sections or different dockets. So that strong coordination will help in enhancing their protection. Then the other point which comes across both Rwanda and Uganda is about the whole element of the psychosocial programming. Education is right there when they need education. And we are seeing that the parents seem to be losing that grip. They feel depressed because of the situation. To what extent are we providing psychosocial support, or are we building psychosocial programming within our interventions to strengthen the child protection element of children? And I think that would be very important and will apply to all cases, both Rwanda and also I've seen this quite a number of cases that quite often the psychosocial element is at the by the way, but I think it is an important part which should be brought alongside. Then the other point about the policies. I think Mark raises a very interesting point about some of the policies in Uganda, but it again throws out a lot of concern. To what extent are we having adequate policies or planning frameworks to protect refugees? For example, the Ugandan setting, you find that we have a decentralized system, whereas the central government may be conscious about refugees. To what extent are the central governments conscious about the needs of these children? So I think it is important that the planning frameworks and even the policies that we bring should take consideration the needs of the refugee children. And that would be able to enhance the protection of these children. Mark raises a very strong point about barriers of education. And I want to emphasize this point, that we need to catalog what are those barriers of education to children. If we can identify those barriers, then I think we should work out a process. How can these ones be addressed so that the children can be well protected? Because the study clearly says, and I think it also confirms other studies, that education is very key in protecting children. But my other question again linked to education is, we've seen the education of adolescents. To what extent are we looking at the early childhood education for the very young people, especially the young children among the refugees? I think it is important that that element should also be addressed so that this could even prepare the children for for classes or to catch up in terms of language when they go to start their classes for those very, very young children. Then the other point I think is the whole issue about advocacy. I think looking from the presentation, reading the presentation, it raises the whole element of the advocacy. Clearly from the Rwandan case, we are saying that the support is stopping in senior 3 or F3. And in Ugandan case, I think they are not getting full support. I think the challenge is that how can we advocate moving from this half loaf to a whole loaf, which I think is important, that this type of data is important also to be disseminated to some of the key actors for them to be able to identify some of the issues that create vulnerability among children. Then lastly, the whole point about teachers. I want to raise the point about teachers, that the teachers, I think, have not been empowered enough, which also links with all and most of the key actors, that we don't seem to be investing enough in empowering them to identify risks for refugee children, which also leads to other vulnerable children. So I think as people who are in the program areas, we need to identify, or we need to see how do we empower the teachers to be able to identify the children at risk, and they should be able to address these issues. Otherwise, as it is, I think the children will not have a protective environment within the school environment. And I think that's very important. I will stop there for the time being.
Thank you, Alfred. Yes, it's great to have your insight into this. I think it's a very complex issue, set of issues. There's still quite a few clarifications as well that are coming in from people listening. So what I suggest is that I just read out a couple of them, which are clarifications or comments. I think we have time for perhaps two or three questions before we have to wrap up. So let me just highlight a few things. And of course, for those of you listening, you can actually read a lot of people's comments just on the chat box. So we won't go into all of them. Someone commented and said, it's interesting how the findings recall situations in many communities which are not refugee situations. So yeah, some of these findings are applicable in other contexts. InterAid wanted to make a clarification, just to put right that although InterAid is among the research stakeholders, they just want to clarify that the full name is InterAid Uganda and not simply InterAid, but InterAid Uganda. So thanks for that clarification. I'm going to pick out a few questions here. I think there was one about the methodologies to capture inputs from younger children. I think Mark spoke a little bit about the body mapping and the challenges involved with that. I think there are a lot about the schools, so maybe I can sort of make this one give you one about schools. People are asking, although schools are seen as protected places for children, are there examples where schools are not safe places? And also linked to that was another question about, it's from a different person, attention or misunderstanding in the perceptions of communities who want education, and the approach of agencies advocating for the importance of education. Aren't they therefore all on the same page? So a little bit about schools. Communities wanting schools, there not being enough money, agencies perhaps advocating for them, but there's a bit of a confusion there, and also can we assume that schools are safe places? Mark and or Alfred, would you like to respond to that, and then we'll ask another question afterwards. Mark, do you want to have a go first, or Alfred? Alfred, would you like to
respond? I'll just respond very quickly. Go right ahead, Alfred. Yes, I think this research did very, very clearly highlight the protective nature of education as something where everybody's on the same page. I think child protection actors are often a little bit skeptical that their work will disappear into education work if it's perceived to be the same issue. But I think what we heard very clearly in these settings is that these two things go together, and I really thank Alfred for highlighting the work that needs to be done with teachers. We frankly did not hear much of abuses happening in schools themselves. I think that is because either A, a lot of work had been done with schools in these communities so that schools were genuinely protective environments, and or even if they were facing, for example, corporal punishment in schools, parents still preferred for their children to be in schools than not to be in them. Two last points that I'll make, and then I'll hand the microphone over to Alfred, is that I do think that the policy questions and the extent to which adequate policies are being included in the planning frameworks is crucial. And even though this is a ground-up methodology that starts from community members' voices, I think there's very strong grounds for advocacy to work with central government. So this is the kind of research that can create learning, that can speak from the very ground level of the refugee experience right to top policymakers. And there is a lot of learning that can be gleaned here from those who advocate on behalf of these populations. And finally, I would add, I highlighted the livelihoods because that is what communities highlighted. But as Alfred very clearly pointed out, the need to incorporate psychosocial programming into this as well, either through schools or through the other community child protection mechanisms, is right on, and I would second that. Over to you, Alfred.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I think you pretty answered most of the issues on education. I just want to emphasize the issues on in terms of the perception. I think the community identifies education as an issue. I don't know whether the person asking the question is indicating that the agencies implementing have a different perception on education. My understanding from the presentation is that the community values education as an important point. And I think from what we are seeing in most of the environment, refugee environment, conflict environment, creating education opportunities even as the conflict ends, I think it is extremely important, and it creates a bit of normalcy. And I think that is quite important to us. And I think it would also reduce the harm that is related to that. But just allow me also to raise the point of the income generating activities raised by Mark, which I felt we need to be cautious of. But we've seen some of the responses where we have where programs have been aimed at empowering families of refugees or even IDPs to be able to support their children. Some of the support that has been provided has instead created more problems for parents, to the children, whereby some of the ideas that have been supported are pushing the providers, the mothers, away from the homes to go in the market where they spend nights. And as such, we find that the caring for children has been highly jeopardized. So I think the issue about IDA is important, but I think it has to be taken in the context to ensure that the ideas that are brought on board are not those ideas that will bring more problems to protection of children.
Thank you, Alfred. That's great. Okay, with time permitting, I'm going to combine a number of questions around community child protection mechanisms into sort of one big question. I'll invite Mark to respond and then Alfred, and I think we'll wrap up after that. So this is I'll do my best to summarize 3 questions in one. Okay, so there are a lot of questions around the nature and the impact of community-based child protection mechanisms. There is, the first question looks at refugees in a refugee setting with a diverse population, looking at cultural, religious, and nationality. There's a question as to, is there actually an integrated mechanism developing, or actually are there a number of segregated different mechanisms? There's also a question around, how do we know that these community-based child protection mechanisms are actually working? I think, Mark, you'll particularly like this question. In some contexts, are they increasing risks for children? And an example is given, for example, through lack of confidentiality. And then there's also a bit of a clarification that's asked for when Mark, you referred to community-based child protection mechanisms, but in the recommendations you're talking about family and community mechanisms or religious ones. So the question is, do you mean that these are that the committees are established by external agencies, or that the religious and family and community mechanisms are the same? So a bit of clarification needed. Is it internal, external groups or committees or mechanisms that are established, and also the quality level, and how do these mechanisms interlink, or are they all parallel based on a cultural, religious, or national affiliation? So I hope you've got that. And Mark, I'll give it to you first, and then Alfred.
All right, I'll try to be very quick here. I would also just start by supporting what Alfred said about the need for caution around livelihoods. And that's something where, if you go to the CPC website and follow the link to the Livelihoods and Economic Strengthening Task Force, we are undertaking a lot of other pieces of research to understand how livelihoods can be done in the right way, that they do ultimately protect children and not, for example, take parents away from the home. What we found very clearly in Uganda was that the kinds of jobs that parents were required to take, being part of the informal economy and being very discriminated against in the Kampala community.
Go ahead, Mark.
Were exactly the kinds of unsafe livelihoods that you would hope not to see. So the question is how to do this in a way that actually contributes to. On the effectiveness of the mechanisms, first of all, let me start with the one about internal and external groups and say that both did exist in these camps. There were child protection committees, as we saw clearly in Uganda. The same kinds of committees existed in Rwanda, but they do not appear from the voices of refugees at all. So these are not perceived as a mechanism that they turn to. The committees that had been established by international actors. And so I think what we saw here, which is not a new finding anywhere, it appeared in every piece of research on community-based child protection mechanisms, is that these mechanisms are more effective when you build on what already exists, rather than setting up your own group or your own committee. Finally, in terms of their effectiveness and how do you make sure that they are safeguarding information about children and doing this in an appropriate way, I think this is what I was trying to say about raising the level of quality of the religious groups, of the clan-based structures, doing work directly with them to up the ante on their understanding of child protection and what role they could play, bringing in the important notions of confidentiality that often are lacking. I think that would be a key entry point, is working directly with those groups to raise the quality of what they're doing, rather than setting up a parallel committee that may be speaking a different language and in a way that the existing mechanisms are not capturing and able to hear. So I hope that answers the question, and I'm sure Alfred will do so far more eloquently than I can.
Thanks, Mark, and over to you, Alfred, for the final word.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I think I want to speak on that very point about the mechanisms. I think we cannot say we should use either or, as I think both formal and informal mechanisms are extremely very important. And I think, as Mark said, I think it is important for us to identify what are those informal mechanisms and build on their strength. And I think the formal mechanisms should also ensure that they build on the resilience of the communities, the resilience of the children. I think that's the most important thing. If the programming can build on the resilience of the children and the communities, I think that will be extremely very important. So in such a way, we shall be able to have an integrated mechanism, and I think things will work. Then the other question that links, are they really working? I think this is something that is asked, or the question has been asked a number of times, but I think we are seeing ourselves evolving. And I think as we move along, we are seeing ourselves developing indicators to measure whether these things are working. But I think we also appreciate that some of these child protection responses, quite often, we can only achieve them in the long term. But I think, as Mark said, we are seeing some outcomes for children, especially when we are talking about the informal systems. I think we are seeing them providing support to children. So I must say they are working, but I think the question is that we must put in place a better measure to assess how effective the systems are. I think this is another area to improve on in terms of in the area of child protection.
Thank you, Alfred. I just think we should wrap up now. It's nearly 4:30. It's been a good webinar, very informative. I'd really like to thank both our speakers for really the effort that you both put into sharing your learning and understanding with us. And also just to thank all of you, the audience, the listeners. We've really had a good webinar in terms of the engagement, the questions, the comments. If you want to listen to this again, or anyone you know would like to listen to it, you can see on your screen now, well, myself and Mark's contact details, which includes the website. If you go to those home pages, it will be clearly marked where you will find the recording. We will, it takes a little bit of time to do the recording, but we will do it as quickly as we can and post it. And obviously feel free to be in touch with us if you have any questions or would like to link with anyone in particular. So many thanks, and we look forward to having you all back for the next one. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Alfred.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.